just because I don't want to neglect any of the folks in the back. So, but we are going to get started because we have a lot to get through tonight. So, welcome to our workshop. My name is Jennifer Mortensen. I am the Outreach Director of the Washington Trust for Historic Preservation. And I'm actually going to start by introducing Chris Moore, who's going to welcome folks. He's our Executive Director, so we'll go ahead and let him welcome.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you to all for coming this evening. My name is Chris Moore. I'm the Executive Director of the Washington Trust, and it's really nice to see some good, friendly faces here, and some new faces as well. And it's really, I literally just walked in, so I'm not sure if Jay covered this or not, but we have our board, which is a wonderful board of 25 plus people from around the state committed to historic preservation. We meet 4 times a year. Being a statewide, that's essentially what we can manage. And in doing so, we do travel across the state and meet in different places. And oftentimes, our Friday afternoons are taken up with tours and meeting with folks, and followed by our Saturday morning board meeting. And we really wanted to take an opportunity in thinking about coming to Spokane, thinking about the annual members meeting, which we're having immediately following this, is how can we be perhaps more impactful? How can we have a better presence? How can we engage better with the community rather than just coming and going on tours? And I think I really give credit to our staff, to Jennifer, to Logan, who's a board member who also works with the Spokane City and County Preservation Program, and others who thought, well, let's maybe switch it up a little bit differently. And so, to a certain degree, you're guinea pigs from the standpoint that we want to do an advocacy workshop, want to engage people, and want to highlight some of the successes that have happened here locally and how we got to those successes, how you all got to those successes. And so I'm really, really pleased that we're going to kind of do it this way, hold a workshop, and hopefully we'll be able to implement this kind of a dynamic as we travel around the state and meet for our quarterly meetings in the future. So I'm really pleased about that and thankful to all of you for being here. I did want to just quickly, before I hand it back over to Jennifer, just thanks our sponsors. We have had a number of sponsors to help make our annual members meeting happen, and for this as well. And it's really, really important, and we're really, really grateful to have those sponsors to help us do the meaningful work across the state. So quickly, I'll go through the list. I want to thank Authentic Restoration Services, Bassetti Architects, Building Work, which is an architectural firm, Coghlan Porter Lundeen, which is a structural engineering firm, Legacy Restoration, Townshend Cellar, and Visit Spokane. I also want to really thank the Northwest Museum of Arts and Culture for allowing us to be in this space tonight, and Betsy Gombuski, who I'm sure a lot of you know, happens to be a board member of the Washington Trust and really facilitated that. And then I also just lastly wanted to talk, you'll hear about it a lot tonight, talk about the importance of our local partners. And we have some really great ones here, both organizationally and individually. And so I really want to thank Spokane Preservation Advocates for their support of today, this afternoon, and this evening. We are really, really fortunate to have a group that operates on the local level with the commitment, the influence, and the dedication that Spokane Preservation Advocates has. I can tell you that Spokane wouldn't look the way it does today without that support and work of SPA. It simply wouldn't happen. And we also are very, very fortunate to have some individual supporters as well. I want to thank Paul and Bridget Piper for their support of this evening, and Paul and Janet Mann, to whom I cannot express enough thanks, not just for tonight, but for the incredible work Paul specifically has done in preservation across the state, and the incredible patience Janet has shown in allowing him to do that work. So with that, I will pass it back over to Jennifer, and welcome. We're really excited for this evening.
On screen. So I wanted to start just quickly by, hopefully, I only printed 20, so hopefully everyone can see the agenda for this evening. So we're going to start by introducing all the sort of players in preservation, statewide statewide partners and then local partners. And then we'll go into talking about historic preservation advocacy, kind of what it is and what that means. We'll talk a little bit about national, state, and local designations and kind of those frameworks. And then we're going to talk about the Browne's Edition, which is a really great historic preservation success recently here in Spokane. Excuse me. And then we'll leave some time at the end for questions. So that's kind of the quick outline, but we'll get started with talking about partners. So the work of historic preservation would not be possible without partnerships, and partnerships exist at all levels. And you can see here on the screen, hopefully the folks in the back can see. Feel free to move forward if you want to join us up here. But I've split up some of the main players in preservation into three categories: nonprofit, government, and private. There's a ton of people, a ton of organizations, different types of organizations, and it can get very confusing if you're not kind of living and breathing and eating this stuff like I am, because that's my job. So I wanted to provide sort of a quick framework of who's who in each category. So for nonprofits, you have the National Trust for Historic Preservation, which is headquartered in Washington, D.C. and has offices all around the country. And then you have the Washington Trust, which is a statewide organization, which is the organization I work for. And although our names are very similar, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the Washington Trust for Historic Preservation, we are affiliated mainly in mission. So we're not technically a part of them. We're independent 501c3s. And then, as Chris mentioned, Spokane is really lucky to have a local nonprofit organization, Spokane Preservation Advocates, who does some of that nonprofit work here on the ground. Not all towns have it. I would say most of the larger cities in Washington have at least a group. Some are more functional than others. Spokane's is quite functional. And for some of those towns that don't have their own, sometimes the Washington Trust serves as that kind of nonprofit voice and that nonprofit help in those situations. And then there's the government side. So there's the nonprofit side and there's the government side, and sometimes there's some confusion about the differences. So nationally, we have the National Park Service, which is where the National Register is housed. And so we actually work a lot with the National Park Service, not just with register listings, but with a lot of heritage and history activities. And then I have a bullet point about the Advisory Council, which there's a national version and a state version, which we'll get to that a little bit later. And then there's the Washington State Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation, colloquially known as DAP, if you've heard of that acronym, DAHP. We sometimes get confused with DAHP, and that's probably because we partner with them all the time in lots of programs. So we are a nonprofit, they're a government agency, and we partner with them regularly and we're both statewide. They're housed in Olympia, we're headquartered in Seattle, and so sometimes it can get a little confusing. And then for government locally, we have the City County Historic Preservation Office here in Spokane, which we'll get introduced to those folks later. And then private, of course, there are individuals, much like yourself, who are interested in preservation, and then grassroots neighborhood groups, Browne's Edition, Neighborhood Council, and sometimes those grassroots groups become nonprofits if they decide that incorporating is the way to go, but sometimes they don't, and they're just community groups or local groups that work toward preservation, and those are great partners too. Okay, so as I mentioned, sometimes we get confused with DAP, DAHP. So I've listed a few of the things that we do and a few of the things that DAP does that you might have interacted with, and I'll, as I go through the list, you'll see why some of the confusion might be there. But as a nonprofit, our primary goal is to help people save places and that contribute to their community. So some of the ways we do that is the Most Endangered Places program. We have a small grant program called the Sowinski Fund, and we operate the state's Main Street program, which is a partnership with DAP. But we operate it in our Main Street Director Browne is hopefully going to speak a little bit later. And then we do a lot of educational and outreach stuff, particularly the Youth Heritage Project is our main educational program, and workshops like this. We have copies of our magazine outside. Hopefully you all can grab a copy of that. And then partnerships, as I said, we partner with DAP and then also local organizations all across the state. And preservation policy, which I'll talk a little bit more about. We lobby in both Olympia and Washington, D.C. for good preservation policy and laws. And then stewardship. We are the owners of the Stinson Green Mansion in Seattle, which you are all welcome to come and take a tour next time you're in town. And so that's where our offices are, and we were very, very fortunate to receive that donation from Patsy Bullock Collins, a philanthropist in Seattle. So on the other side, on the government side, DAP does a lot of official consultations. So with permitting and anything that kind of needs to go through official review, that's what DAP does. We're not a regulatory agency. They do all the regulatory stuff. We just get to do the fun community stuff. we don't have to tell anybody, no, you can't do that. They are also the authority on historic significance for Washington State. I'll go in a little bit more on that in a minute, but especially for the National Register here in Washington State. They provide, they're the sort of the vehicle for some of the funding opportunities here in Washington. The barn, courthouse, and cemetery programs that we manage under contract for them comes from the state legislature, goes through their office, and they contract with us. And they also manage all the tax credit, the state tax credit, they manage the national tax credit program for Washington, and then they also manage the special valuation program for Washington State. And then they are a great resource for information for their databases. I don't know if any of you, I think it only has one S actually, I might have mistyped it, but Wizard is their online database system, which is actually a really impressive tool, and not all states have it, and that's really great. And they do a lot more than this, especially in archaeology, but these are kind of some of the main things that maybe most of you might have been aware of, or maybe could have confused with us. Like I say, we partner all the time, so it's perfectly reasonable and understandable that that might be a bit of a confusion. So I want to talk a little bit more about some of the programs that I mentioned that we run, to talk about just who we are, what we do, and introduce ourselves to you if you haven't met us before. So these are some of the programs, I mentioned a few of them, and I'm going to focus on these four on the left-hand side here. But I'm happy to answer any questions about any other programs afterward. We just want to keep our schedule on time. So first, I want to talk about the public policy piece, which I mentioned a minute ago. So as a nonprofit, we go to Washington, D.C. every year in March, which if anyone's interested in joining us, we would love to have you. We try to get one representative from each legislative district. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. But we go and we meet with all of our national representatives and talk to them about national policies, talk to them about funding for preservation offices and tribal preservation offices like DAP and all of our tribes around Washington, and basically get that face-to-face time and saying preservation is important. As you're looking at this bill or that bill, please keep us in mind. And it really is important to have that face-to-face contact. And like I said, if anyone's interested in joining us, we'll be going in March, and we just assemble a group of people who are interested, board members, anyone who wants to go. We put together a schedule, and we hit the hill for a day. And it's a long day, but it's really fun, and it's actually pretty interesting to get involved in kind of seeing our representatives face to face. So if you're able to come, we will definitely put you in a meeting with your representative or their representatives. So if you want that opportunity, we'd love to have you. And then another place where we go to talk about preservation policy is Olympia for our state. And actually, Chris, who introduced himself earlier and welcomed everyone, goes to a meeting when the legislature is in session called Heritage Caucus, and it involves heritage groups, arts groups, and it's 7 a.m. in Olympia every Wednesday, and he goes and he advocates, and they talk about bills, and they talk about everything that's going on in Washington State, and we keep our eye on everything, and we make sure that preservation is part of the conversation. So as a statewide nonprofit organization, we're pretty uniquely positioned to be able to advocate in both of these areas, and there isn't really anyone else doing that for Washington State except for us, and hopefully you all when you come to Washington DC with us. And then of course, on the local level, we love to support our local partners, and under the bullet point here, I just put a comment about the ordinance changes that went through, how long ago was that, a year?
Yes.
About a year ago, which allowed for the formation of local historic districts. We were pleased to support those changes and submit a letter in support of that. And so we love doing stuff like that too, to support our local partners all over the state. Another program of ours, I mean, kind of signature program, is our Most Endangered Places program. We accept nominations for Most Endangered Places any time of year, and basically we have our preservation committee of our board reviews those nominations and selects kind of which campaigns we'll be involved in. And I've just listed some of the support that we offer, to those campaigns. That doesn't mean we don't offer support to anybody else. It just means that when we've listed a place on our most endangered list, those are the campaigns we're going to focus on, we're going to spend more energy on, we're going to be kind of pounding the pavement a little bit harder on those, because we've sort of recognized those as our higher priority. So I've got a few up here that are Eastern Washington focused, one success story and two hopefully in the works stories. The Colville Indian Agency cabin actually the project was just completed, and we're going to be publishing an article about that in our next magazine, so stay tuned for that. St. Ignatius out in Colfax, if anyone's interested in a big development project, we'd love to see that one reused. And then of course, everyone in this room, I'm sure, is familiar with the Jensen bird. That's been a long process, and we're not going to celebrate until we actually see a project happening, but it's looking much better than it has in the past, and we'll just leave it at that. Another project I wanted to highlight that I think really shows a good way that the Washington Trust can partner, and what puts us in a unique position is the Beverly Bridge, which goes across the Columbia. I don't think you can see it, but there's a little arrow right there. It's right there in the middle of our state. Cuts the Palouse to Cascades trail, which used to be the John Wayne Pioneer Trail and was recently renamed. This was nominated to our most endangered list. We've been involved in advocating for it because the trail stops, literally. The bridge, it hasn't been used in decades, and there's a good coalition of groups that want to reopen it for bicycle traffic and recreational use for state parks. And as a statewide nonprofit, we were able to be the sort of holding partner for some funds that there were some other railroad bridges that had to be replaced, and they were historic. And in preservation, one of the things that happens is if something has to come down, because in this particular case, they needed bridges there, more modern bridges, and they weren't as significant as the Beverly Bridge. And so what they did was they made an agreement to take those bridges down, replace them, but as mitigation, they not gave us, but we held, I think it was $130,000 to go toward the Beverly Bridge. And we managed an RFP process where we hired an engineering firm to look at this bridge, see how much it would cost to rehabilitate it for recreational purposes, and we were able to submit that assessment to the governor, to our state legislators, and show, like, these are the numbers, these are the costs, and the state is providing, I believe it's $5.1 million to rehabilitate this bridge. So this is a really great success story. It kind of hits a lot of great things like recreation, preservation, and hopefully economic development for the towns along the trail, especially in this area. We were able to partner with a bunch of great people and great groups, especially the Palouse to Cascades Trail Coalition, and we kind of got it done, and it was this really great thing to be involved in, and as a statewide nonprofit, we were able to kind of be the facilitators of that assessment and advocate to our state representatives, and so those are kind of some of the roles that we play in the state that we're really proud of, and that are really exciting. So there is a firm on board actually doing the design now of this bridge, so we're excited to see that project move forward. Another thing, we manage 3 grant programs for DAP, DAHP. One is barns, one is courthouses, and one is cemeteries. I'm going to talk about the barn one because that's the one that I manage. So the Heritage Barn Initiative is a great program where we get funding from the state, and then they give us a contract to manage it, so we get to run around and see a bunch of cool barns, meet amazing people. In fact, I visited 2 barns in Whitman County, and 1 barn in Spokane County yesterday, and 2 barns in Pend Oreille County this morning. It's been super fun, and it's a program that provides grants to historic barns all across the state. We actually have another round of applications closing on Wednesday, so it'll be a busy week for us for another round of great grants. And then I just wanted to quickly, the folks who attended my workshop about barn grants will have seen these pictures before. This is the Heidenreich barn out in Colfax. They got funding for a new roof and some paint. And so these are my 2 favorite before and after because it always gets oohs and ahs from the audience. This is like literally the poster child for our program. It's our logo on the paperwork. This is an early project. I think it was actually the first round, if not definitely the second. And then the other really great one is the Calf Creek Ranch. So this is what it looked like when it got a grant. And then there was some inclement weather, and we kind of thought that the project was over. And they said no. They had a friend of the crane, and they literally attached the crane to the ridge pole and pulled the barn up. Obviously, they got in a little bit more than they bargained for, and actually, quite a lot of the materials of the barn kind of snapped back into place, and obviously they had to do a lot of work to reinforce the structure after it was standing back up. But that's what it looks like today. So they put a new roof on it, a metal roof, which is allowed, and obviously a great coat of paint. So we've seen some really great success stories, and we're starting our second round of cemetery programs this year, or cemetery grants this year. So we get out and about across the state, and we are really happy to partner with DAP to offer these programs. And so those are just kind of some of the things you might see us around doing. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Browne to talk a little bit about the state's Main Street program, which is another partnership with DAHP that is operated by us, and Browne is the director.
So one of the things that I love about working for the Washington Trust for Historic Preservation is that we really are in the business of community building. And one of the ways that I am very proud that we are able to do that is by running the state's Main Street program. So some of you may be familiar that the National Trust for Historic Preservation, way back in the late 70s, early 80s, was identifying a lot of economic trends that were really hurting our historic downtown districts. And they, for very obvious reasons within their mission, took it upon themselves to look at what are some of the things that communities can do to pull themselves back up and to really make the downtowns the heart of the community, but also the economic driver for the community like they used to be. And so they went through a very interesting process of some trial and error in terms of trying things out in a few communities around the nation to say, what are some best practices And the ultimate goal of that and the culmination of that work was that they came out with what we call the Main Street 4-Plan approach. And it is a way for any local community to organize themselves around a strong economic downtown district. And so fast forward nearly 40 years, and we have a very strong national program called the National Main Street Center. And actually, we've got somebody from that organization traveling with me around the state this week. Her name's Norma Ramirez-Denise, and she's in the back, so wave, Norma. And so we have a very wonderful network within the world of Main Street. We have the National Main Street Center, and then most states have a state coordinating program, like the one that Washington Trust is fortunate to coordinate in partnership with DAP. But then the real heart of Main Street really happens at the local level. And so all across the state of Washington, there are over 30 communities that have their own nonprofit organization that has been established. Most of them have their own full-time executive director and many, many wonderful volunteers who are contributing to their missions. And the great thing about Main Street is that it is locally driven. So they're using that framework that I mentioned, that 4-point approach, which really focuses on not just one thing to keep a downtown vital, but how can we create momentum and strategically push things in the world of design? What's the look and feel of the downtown? How are we focusing on historic preservation within that? The economic side of it, what's the business mix? And is it a viable community? The organization side of it, are we outreaching and bringing people into our mission so that everybody really feels like they have a place in the downtown? And then promoting the district as well, the marketing piece. How are we letting people know what is available in the downtown district, and how are we bringing people together to make it that sort of living room, that third place that we love about a strong downtown. So there are towns all across the state, as I mentioned. We work with Port Townsend, Colfax, Ellensburg, Camas, and many, many in between on strategies to help them increase their capacity as local organizations, because again, it is very locally driven. So if you are interested in this, we have resources at the table. If you'd like to connect with me and learn more about what it might mean for your community as a framework that you can use to get people organized around your downtown. And one of the opportunities that we have, what's the technology here, Jay?
I got it.
Okay, perfect, thanks. One of the things that we host is a statewide preservation and Main Street conference, and it's going to be in downtown Wenatchee, April 6th through 8th of this year. And it is a conference in the sense that we have breakout sessions throughout a 3-day period, lots of networking opportunities. So if you are interested in preservation and or Main Street, and we really believe that they're very much one and the same, we would really encourage you to attend this as an opportunity to learn about some of the best practices and the exciting things that are happening in the state, but also as a way to connect with others who are interested in this work as well. So that's an open invitation to you, and again, connect with us at the information table as you're leaving if you'd like to learn anything more about Main Street or about our upcoming conference.
Thank you. All right. So, checking the time. Pretty good. Okay. So I did an overview of us as your statewide partner, DAP as a sort of government side partner, and now we're going to talk some about the local partners here in in Spokane. We've got, like I said, you're lucky to have an active nonprofit here in the city. We've got the Spokane City County Historic Preservation Office here. And then we're, of course, going to be talking about Browne's Addition a little bit later. So I'll first start with actually Dave Shockley of Spokane Preservation Advocates, who's on this side of the room. And he'll just do a quick intro of SPA and the work they do.
Hi, I'm Dave Shockley, Executive Coordinator for Spokane Preservation Advocates. I work 20 hours a week. I'm the only paid staff, and everything else that gets accomplished by SPA is done by the volunteers. So we have a great group of volunteers. I am one of the founding members of this 22-year-old organization, and I'm also currently serving as the chair of the Spokane City County Historic Landmarks Commission, and I'm a past board member of the Washington Trust. SPA was formed to supplement the work of other local preservation organizations and also to offer a strong voice for advocacy in local preservation issues. We currently have approximately 400 listings in our database that are current members, and many of those are couples. Our offices are located in downtown Spokane in the American Legion building pictured here. The mission of SPA is to preserve and enhance the historic character of Spokane and Spokane County through advocacy, education, and preservation. Our board is composed of our officers, our committee chairs, and some members at large. Our committees include the following: Advocacy Committee monitors preservation issues and acts on them as needed. Communications oversees our newsletter, website, social media, and other and our community outreach booth. Development includes board and member development. They also oversee our events and they do fundraising. Education offers free lecture series, and we do hands-on preservation projects that we call our Doing It projects. And then we have our Heritage Grants Committee that manages our grants program that offers $10,000 a year in grants in 2 cycles. One of our biggest draws is that we have quarterly membership meetings in historic venues or homes that are typically not accessible to the public. These meetings we have potluck hors d'oeuvres and wine, and a self-guided tour of the home is offered to the attendees. There's a brief meeting where we let the attendees know what our committees are up to, but it's primarily a social event, and non-member guests are encouraged to attend, to get to know our group and what we're doing. Some of our annual events include an auction fundraiser dinner in the spring, a pub crawl in the summer, an historic home tour in the fall, the Preservation Awards program also in November, and our annual holiday party in December. Educational programs, Doing It projects, and booth events occur at various times throughout the year. And the quarterly membership meetings happen in March, June, and September. So every month or two there's an event that's occurring for us. There are many opportunities to volunteer on one of our committees, to serve on the board, to volunteer to help with events, or to simply be a member for an additional voice for advocacy issues. I have brochures about our organization out on the information table, and they do have a membership form inside, and we invite you to get involved and have some fun while helping to preserve Spokane's architectural heritage. Thank you.
I really want to say thank you again to SPA, not only for being here tonight, but for all of the work that they do here on the ground. And our work would not be possible without local partners in so many cases. So it's really wonderful to support them and to get involved in all the great programming they're doing. And it sounded like there were several SPA members or board members that when we were doing those earlier introductions, so hopefully you all get a chance to mingle afterward. So now I'm going to introduce Logan from the City County Historic Preservation Office to give an introduction to his office, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty.
How's everybody doing? I was hoping that Dave was going to show us pictures of SPA members chained to buildings or something. I'm not allowed to do that because I work for the city and the county, so I really like to see other people chained to buildings. I work for the City County Historic Preservation Office. I used to work here, so it's kind of funny to be standing up here talking again. I've been working at the Historic Preservation Office for just over a year. And I was primarily hired to facilitate the Browne's Edition Local Historic District project that I'll talk about in a little bit. But mostly I just want to tell you a little bit about our office, what we do, and why you might talk to us on any given day. This is my boss. She's a rock star. She's not here today. She has a family emergency, but she's our historic preservation officer. She used to work for DAP, so she has a really good understanding of what happens at the state level. She's also been a Main Street executive director, so she understands Main Street, and she's on the board, so she really gets the whole picture, and I'm privileged to get to learn from her. This is some of the things we do. We were formed in 1981. We became the first, 1981 is when the code happens to allow for certified local governments in Washington State, and we became the first CLG in 1986. That's kind of exciting. We only have one full-time permanent staff, that's Megan, and then I'm a project employee, and then we have our board of commissioners. There's 11 of you right now, I believe. Two of our commissioners are actually here. One of them was just talking to you. And then Sylvia is also here, another one of our board members or commissioners. And they make the hard decisions, so Megan and I don't have to make them. And we provide a staff report, and when there's a really controversial change to a building or a demolition, we let them make those tough decisions. They're made up of, there's a sort of a professional makeup, including a real estate appraiser, architects, archaeologists, historic construction specialists, historians, a good combination of folks that can make these hard decisions from a variety of viewpoints instead of just me making decisions, and I like to lock myself to buildings. So, our main role is to manage the Spokane Register of Historic Places. There's about 350 buildings individually listed on the Spokane Register of Historic Places, and now there's like 270 more contributing buildings on the Spokane Register of Historic Places because Browne's Edition has just become a local register historic district. So I'm gonna have to rework all those numbers in my brain. But we manage that register, so when somebody wants to add their building to that register, we receive the nomination in our office. We work with the consultant or the homeowner to try to make that nomination the best representation of the history of that property, to make the case for why it's significant. We're really working again with the consultants to try to make that happen. We, like I said, staff the commission, and so the commission meets once a month, as long as we have business on the third Wednesday. Those are public hearings. You can always come to them, and you can even speak sometimes if you want to have your opinion heard on a certain project. But they're all public hearings where we make those decisions. And Megan and I staff that, so we provide recommendations to the commission, and we do site visits to try to provide as much information to the decision makers as possible. Well, like I said, new properties we manage, but also changes to existing properties. So if you own a property that's individually listed and you want to put a big addition on it, you're going to come talk to us. The way this works oftentimes is not that you know you need to come talk to us, but when you want to do your addition, you go down, you apply for a building permit, and the grumpy permit tech across the counter says, this is historic. You're probably going to need to talk to the historic preservation officer first. We try to be not grumpy and as painless as possible. We work with whatever their project is, try to guide them so that the project is compatible with their the property that they have. If they want to do a big addition, can we put it on the back of the house and not the front? These sorts of things. And so we really try to make sure that the changes that are made to the historic properties on the register are sensitive. We also deal with demolitions. Unfortunately, sometimes historic properties are demolished. Most frequently, it's properties that are in National Register historic districts, so they don't have that specific protection that the local register gives them. But we do have some pieces in our local ordinance to allow us to even review those demolitions, and so the commission takes up that work as well. Can you go back real quick? Let's see what else I'm missing. The incentive, that's the cool part, right? I'm just talking about all the stick over here. There's also a really great carrot that we get to offer. It's called a special valuation incentive. It's a tax incentive that helps reduce your property tax over a period of 10 years. And so if you have your building individually listed on the Spokane Register of Historic Places, and you plan to do some sort of rehabilitation to it that the legislature considers substantial, meaning that you're going to spend 25% of the assessed value of the building on the rehabilitation in a 25-month period, then you can ask to have those costs reduced from your assessed value for the next 10 years. So we work really closely with either developers who are interested in doing historic properties, like the former Otis Hotel that will open as Hotel Indigo here soon, or any number of historic big buildings and also little houses in town. And sometimes, especially with the commercial buildings, these developers manage to zero out their property taxes because they spend $10 million on a building that was valued at $500,000, and they don't pay any property taxes for 10 years. You can see how that can actually be the difference between a project penciling out and a project not penciling out. It doesn't always work that way with homeowners because the numbers it's a game of scale. But oftentimes the homeowners take advantage of it and they save themselves $1,000, $2,000 a year over the span of 10 years. That takes some of the pain off of that investment that you put back into your property. And most importantly, it keeps you from being punished for rehabilitating your property by having to spend more on property taxes. And state legislators for over 30 years have thought that was a problem. So we're lucky to have that incentive. We also do this other cool thing. We help folks with code relief. Oftentimes, if there's a building code, that's final. Building inspectors don't have a lot of flexibility on that. Sometimes the building official will make exceptions, but we have a piece of our ordinance that allows us to work directly with the building official to try to solve an issue that otherwise would violate the building code, but because it's historic, our office thinks it should be preserved despite the safety risk. So, for example, there's the Paulson building downtown, and they have a great balcony up top there. Not sure if you've been up there, it's pretty sweet. It was where Mrs. Paulson's, it was her spot. And they have some railings up there that don't meet code, but they want to have events up there. And we're able to work with the building official and say, hey, we're off by 3 inches for what the code calls for here. What can we do so that this isn't preventing a certificate of occupancy being issued for this space? And so we try really hard to be a mediating influence to prevent you from having to tear out your cool historic porch because it's not high enough, for example. Yeah. We have a cool website. It looks like this if you want to go over to it. It has, I think, the most interesting things just for the lay person are the listed properties. You can just go find every property that's listed either on the Spokane Register or the National Register. And then we also have a cool map. They're both on the sidebar there to the right. And if you click on the map, I'm working on making a better version of it. But you can click on every property, get a picture of it, go read the nomination for it, look at the management agreement, get a snippet about that property. It's a cool way to explore your built environment, at least figure out where the closest landmark is to your house. And I think that's all I've got for now, unless anybody has any quick questions about our office that I could answer. Cool. Yeah, it's not a, oh yeah, there it is. It's that top little button there. It's a cool project that we did 2 years ago. We worked with Helvetica, a local design firm who likes mid-century a lot. And they worked with us to create a website and do a survey of all of Spokane's, or a large portion of Spokane's, significant mid-century resources. It might challenge your expectations of what historic preservation should be, but I encourage you to hop on there and go take a look at some of those mid-century properties. They're different, they're exciting. One of the national mid-century nonprofits, Yoko Ono, I think is what they're called, they posted a cool circular building down in Texas that's threatened. And so I figured, this might be a circular building in Spokane, and I popped up, and it was one that I had anticipated, but we had a really cool Shadle Park water reservoir. And so we have some of these, and they thought that, the Yoko Ono folks thought that was pretty cool. So I think we have some significant mid-century resources in Spokane that you can check out on that website as well. Anything else? Awesome. I'll be back up in a bit.
Thank you, Logan. That survey was really awesome. We listed it on our kind of best moments in preservation the year after it was finished, and did an article in our magazine. I'm pushing my magazine, can you tell? Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about how do you do it? How do you do preservation? Both the sort of advocacy side and the regulatory side. So we're going to start by a few key things to remember. Every advocacy issue, every preservation issue is different. It depends on which building it is, how much it's valued at, who's the owner, what the economic situation is for the community. There's so many factors that there's not really a single script, a single here's how you do it. Go ahead. It's all negotiation. It's all partnerships. It's all exploring, asking questions, kind of digging into the issue and figuring out what is a solution that can work for all parties involved. And so I thought for tonight, I have these kind of 3 key things to remember, are some of the things that I've taken away from working for the Washington Trust for about 10 years now, and highlighting a couple of projects here that were pretty significant for us. And then I've got another slide about kind of ideas to get involved and ideas for advocacy. But like I said, there's no script. It's all about just kind of digging in and seeing what the possibilities are. And one of the things to remember is that preservation takes time. So when you're working with real estate and historic buildings and big projects, lots of money, or even a little bit of money, fundraising, advocacy, partnerships, conversations, all of that takes time. So when you're interested in preserving a building, remember that doesn't happen overnight. Well, maybe once in a while there's a big dramatic thing that happens, but most of the time it's a multi-year process. In fact, a couple of years ago at our annual fundraiser, Vintage Washington, we were putting together some stats on our most endangered places list, and I was looking at. I was like, oh yeah, all the ones that have been saved were ones we listed several years ago, and the ones that we listed more recently, all still in process. So, like I say, it takes time. And speaking of which, when I was doing those stats, I found the campaign that took us the longest, that was a positive outcome anyway, is the Green Mountain Lookout here, and it was listed, I believe, I'm not going to remember the year. Anyway, it took us 23 years to save this building, kind of from beginning to end. It was a long, very complicated process because it's in a wilderness area, and there are certain restrictions about the way you can work on existing buildings in wilderness areas, the kinds of tools you can use, the kinds of procedures you can use. And so there was a legal battle that happened. I certainly don't really have time to get into all the details, but when I was doing those stats for our fundraiser, I was kind of blown away that it was a success story, but 23 years later. And so that's a good reminder that you sometimes have to be patient. And if you couldn't guess, partnerships are key. This is something that I can't stress enough. If there's an issue that comes up in your community, whether you're in Spokane or nearby, find your partners. And we've been introducing some of us tonight, but I'm sure that there's lots more that would be interested. There's lots of historical societies around, there's lots of groups around, and the more sort of critical mass you can have around an issue, the sort of more success and more impact you end up having. Right now I've got the St. Edward Seminary building up here under partnerships, but really every single success story that we have, partnerships have played a huge role. And so I don't mean to say that that's not the case for any of the others, but this particular one was, again, kind of a long storied success story, and I guess they all have their twists and turns. So this is a building in St. Edward State Park up in Kenmore, and it's been sitting vacant for a couple of decades. I think the last time it was used was in the late 80s, and there was a lot of disagreement about what to do about the building. Some people wanted to take it out. They liked the park as more of a nature area. And then of course there were a lot of us that said, no, that's an amazing building. We have to keep it. It was part of the thematic listing in 2012 for our most endangered places list of resources in state parks that were neglected or are underfunded. And this particular one was a bit of our poster child because the price tag to rehabilitate it originally was about $50 million, and of course state parks is not going to be able to spend that kind of money on one building in their park, especially when they're laying off employees and really going through a bit of a tight squeeze. So we worked with, like I said, a lot of partners, not just state parks, but the city of Kenmore, local folks in the community, Daniel's Real Estate, a developer from Seattle, came in and decided that this building was too good to lose. And so there was a lot of negotiating that went on between state parks and Daniel's and the community and the city, and just figuring out how to let a private investor do a project in the middle of a state park. It was a very complex issue. We went and testified at many of the public meetings. We actually have a former state parks commissioner here who was involved in the process. Like I say, there's so many partners that go into making a success story happen, and this is actually under construction right now. It's slated to open in late 2020, so keep your eye out for that if you're in the Northeast Seattle area. We're super excited about this. This was a really great success story. And then over on the right, the third thing to remember is you're more powerful than you think, especially when you start putting those partnerships together, putting those coalitions together, and getting different parts of the community invested in the project and the advocacy that you're working on. I've got Morgan Middle School here in Ellensburg. This was on our most endangered, listed in, I think, also 2012, maybe it was 2013. And it was a local group called MOM, Modernize Our Morgan, who nominated it to our list. And the school district had gone out to bond to build a new middle school. And the community said, no, we want to fix up our middle school because it's historic, it's a part of our community. They went out to bond 3 times for a new school, and the community voted it down every single time. And they finally got the clue, and Modernize Our Morgan raised $20,000 to do their own assessment of the building that would show that it was sort of financially comparable to renovate this building, rehabilitate this building, rather than tearing it down and building a new one. And we're able to convince the school district to put up a bond to do this project instead. And when they did, the community voted for it, and I think it just opened this year. And so that was a great success story. And it was this little local group that just said, no, we're gonna do it. We're gonna fundraise for the assessment. We're gonna rally the community and make sure people are voting for what the community wants. And so that was a great success story too. And actually recently, there's another school up in Everett where I was part of a workshop in Seattle, kind of similar to this one. And one of the gentlemen who's been working in the Longfellow School in Everett, he came to our workshop and he emailed me later and he said, we went to the school board meeting and we started talking about saving the school because they're planning to demolish it for, what else, a parking lot. And he said, just hearing about preservation made me more confident, made me want to fight for this building and actually attend the meetings, and they got a group together, and now they've assembled not a commission, but basically a committee, a subcommittee for the school district to look at options. And it's not a save yet, but that's another example. Every day I see when people start engaging and people start building a coalition, you have a lot more power than you think. So that's a really important thing to remember. And then, like I said, there's no sort of script to how to do preservation, how to do advocacy, but I just kind of threw up a list of things that you might consider if you're interested in getting involved. Of course, first and foremost, as the public testimony, public comments. Like Logan said, all of the local meetings here in Spokane are public, and that's how it is in every city across the state who has a preservation ordinance. And so you can participate, you can come to the meetings, you can just keep up to date on what's going on, what's being presented, and make your voice heard. Or you could be on the other side and actually submit things in a landmark nomination. Sometimes you need a little assistance from a local historian or a preservation consultant to do that, but and depending on the owner of the building, in some municipalities that's not required, but it certainly is here. So if you know someone who's supportive of having their house or building listed and you want to help them out, that could be a great way to get involved too. Nominate a list, a property of the most endangered places list. If there's an advocacy issue that you're passionate about and you're trying to build that coalition, build those partnerships, come to us, talk to us, and see what we can help with. Follow local land use and planning activities. So in addition to following what's coming up for local landmark designation, following land use and zoning is also a really important thing, because zoning has a big effect on historic properties. When commercial areas get upzoned, that can be very problematic for shorter, sort of smaller historic buildings in those areas. So that's something to definitely keep an eye on, and so that by the time people are paying attention, hopefully it's not too late. Join the Washington Trust, SPA, and other advocacy groups. Always put in a plug for joining. We're both membership organizations. We'd love for you to be members in both, because we're separate organizations who partner together, but we have different areas of effect, and we'd love to have you all as members if you aren't already. Volunteer Dave mentioned several opportunities, especially locally. We would love to get some more volunteer opportunities going for the Washington Trust, which is actually something we're putting a plan together now, so contact us and get involved. Respond to calls to action. So we're always sending out emails and Facebook posts and all kinds of things about writing letters for this or that or the other thing. It does take a little bit of time to do it, but if you can, that's where the coalition and the partnerships really happen, is when people get moving. Join a commission if you have, like Logan mentioned, there are different kind of areas of expertise that. 3 openings. If anyone has any, I don't know which are they at-large positions or?
We need a real estate appraiser.
Real estate.
We need an
At-large.
and then I think we need a historian.
And historian. So if those are skill sets that any of you have, volunteer to join the commission. I will put in a plug from my hometown of Tacoma. I am on the commission there, and it actually is a lot of fun. I mean, we have a good group of commissioners. I'm sure the Spokane group is just as fun. And you get to be involved in what the city's doing and see all these interesting projects. And like Logan said, you do have to kind of make the hard decisions, but you make them as a group most of the time. It's usually pretty unanimous. And so it's nice to be able to deliberate and participate in that. I can give a personal plug for enjoying that myself. And then media. If you've got access to media or you're partnering with SPA or us, that's a great way to just get the word out there. Ask people to talk about it. That's a great way to, like I was saying, build those coalitions, build those partnerships. So, moving along. So, what is historical designation? Basically, a formalized historic preservation program started in the United States in 1966 with the Historic Preservation Act, and I've of course put up the obligatory photo of Penn Station, which was the kind of big issue that got torn down and spurred a lot of the advocacy and outrage. The outrage spurred the advocacy to establish a National Preservation Act, which was passed in 1966. And so that's kind of our big national framework. It created the National Register, and as I mentioned earlier, the National Park Service is one of our national partners. They manage that. It requires specific review processes, and maybe in Historic Preservation 102 we'll go over some of those more nitty-gritty details. If you've ever heard the phrase Section 106, that is through the National Historic Preservation Act. And basically means that the government, the national government, or anything funded by the national government has to go through review if it involves a historic property. And then it established support for a state or a nationwide network of state historic preservation offices like DAP. So it really was a pretty monumental accomplishment, And when we, like I said, go to Washington D.C., we're always advocating for funding for these programs. So we've got the National Register of Historic Places, we've got the Washington Register, we've got the Spokane Register. I wanted to take a little bit of time tonight to talk about each of them. Well, we'll talk a little bit more about some. I want to talk about sort of the differences between them, what they mean, and kind of what it's all about. So, generally speaking, registers, or historical designation, relies on a certain age of a building and what we call integrity, which means kind of, does it look historic? Does it feel historic? Is there kind of enough of that historic character left to convey the historic significance, which is the second section here, whether that's related to an important event or movement or individual or a specific design style or potentially archaeological information. Those are kind of the key categories. And the National Register has its own set of criteria. The Washington Register has its own set of criteria, and the Spokane Register has its own set of criteria. So they're all similar, but a little bit different. The concepts are all very similar, but the language is different. So the National Register has its language, and then each sort of municipality, whether it's the state or each city or county, writes their own language for their register. So, like I say, it's all kind of based on this idea from the National Register, but you got to look at the language for the local. And I've got an asterisk up by age and integrity because the national standard is 50 years. That's what the National Register age requirement is, 50 years old. But in King County, it's 40, and in Seattle, it's 25. So you can be historic and be very young, actually. So it's not across the board 50, but that is the national. That's the national number, and that's most municipalities kind of adopt that. Tacoma, where I'm on the commission, is that way. Spokane is that way. And also, I wanted to mention integrity. So this has been a big issue recently, and I think kind of just in the national conversation about preservation, and that there's some of these resources in our cities that have undergone a lot of change, but those changes have reflected the way the community has used the building, the way the community has loved the building. And sometimes we're trying to sort of reverse the notion that it has to be something very high style, it has to be something in pristine condition, it has to have all these very particular types of history, and try to open up historic preservation to a broader audience and a broader field of buildings and resources. One of the big issues up right now, I'm sure some of you have heard of the Showbox in Seattle, has undergone a lot of changes since it was constructed in 1917, 18, 17, somewhere in there. And then actually it went through a big Art Deco remodel as well, and it's been changed multiple times through the decades. And I attended the landmark meetings for that in Seattle, and the commissioner actually said these changes over time contribute to the significance of this building. And that's not always true with every building. If there's been some really insensitive changes that were not related to the community use, but in this particular case, the commissioners recognized that the way that the building adapted for the community in Seattle was part of that significance. And so the attitude around integrity is shifting a little bit, and I'm really excited to see where it goes and to see how it develops and continues, because there are a lot of places in our communities that are important and historic that may not be quite as grand as a Campbell House or a Davenport or a Fox Theater. So we're working on recognizing more types of buildings. Oh, as I said, I just threw these up, and we're not going to go through each one, but this is the Spokane Register of Historic Places criteria. And I did want to draw special attention to the last one. I've made it impossible to read. But the last one is a pretty new addition in a recent ordinance change that reflects some of those sort of broader ideas of what a historic building can be. And so it talks about representing culture and heritage in ways that the other criteria don't address, but also it references something like intangible heritage, which is something that, if a building conveys some piece of our history or heritage that doesn't have, something physical that you can touch, but a building is involved with that, this is just a really great development in Spokane and a really great addition to the historic preservation program to be able to kind of, like I said, broaden that idea of what qualifies as historic and what qualifies as important. So, okay, moving along. We're actually not too far away. I had some copies of this out there, but there are more people here than I thought would be, so I'm sorry if you didn't get a copy, but I'm happy to send out via email or we can distribute it digitally. This flow chart that I created. I think maybe on the copies, this little line is missing, so I'm sorry about that if that's the case. Zooming into the top here, I'm going to focus right here on the right-hand 3 columns because those are the register pieces. We talked about, I kind of did this side over here of how to save a building, how to do advocacy, and I have a little faded line here because that's a whole other flow chart. And then I had this for another presentation I was doing about preservation generally. There's a thing called an easement that you can put on a property, which we're not going to go into tonight, but that's another way to preserve a building. So I'm going to focus on the right-hand 3 columns that are about the registers and the differences between each of them and kind of how you go about getting onto a register. So I've got these kind of at the top, the situations, right? You've got a person who wants to preserve their property, a person who's concerned about somebody else's property with an unsympathetic owner, someone who owns a property who wants financial support, and someone who just wants a badge saying you're historic and you're important. Great job. And so you can see, sorry, the colors are a little dark, but you can see kind of where each of these falls. So the Washington State Heritage Register and the National Register, a lot of people don't understand, and this is something that I want to stress, those are honorary only. So I've got the honorary acknowledgement goes to both of those. There's no regulations for those buildings unless you're the federal government or the Washington State government if it's a state issue. It's a great honor and it's a wonderful program and it can there are incentives involved in being listed on the National Register, but it does not protect. And Logan was mentioning earlier about there's a bit of a local review that happens with the National Register districts here in Spokane, but that's why the Browne's Addition local district was so significant, is that offers real protections for the properties there. Here's the local register. That's where the real protection comes and the review comes. So to be listed on either the Washington State Register or the National Register, you get to go through DAP. As I was mentioning earlier, they are the local agency in Washington that manages both of those programs. They house the register obviously internally, and then they work with the National Park Service to manage the National Register locally for Washington State. For a local register, you'd have to get involved in a local ordinance, so you'd need to contact Logan's office if you're interested in being listed here in Spokane. I know there are some Pullman folks here. There's a Pullman register as well, contacting the folks in the city who manage that. And then kind of the big hurdle is preparing that nomination form. So a lot of people will opt to hire a preservation consultant for that, especially if it's a kind of a big, complicated commercial property, or if they're looking for some of those tax credits that Logan was talking about. Sometimes it's helpful to have a preservation consultant to guide you through that, but that can be expensive. And there's a lot of really great local knowledge here. So I should have sort of maybe italicized preservation consultant, because there's a lot of historians, local folks who know a lot about history, architectural styles, who could put together a really good nomination and that would be appropriate to be submitted locally or statewide or nationally. And then once you have got that, nomination written, for the two over here, you work with Michael Hauser, who's the state architectural historian, to revise and complete and kind of finalize that information. And I guess I should have had a little box here for contacting the local organization as well. So Logan was saying that he works with people to try to finalize those landmark nominations, making sure they're, all the T's are crossed, I's are dotted. And the folks that work in these offices work with properties all over and know all the architectural history of the area. And Michael Hauser is a vast amount of knowledge about architecture all over Washington, and so they can help say, oh, you should mention this architectural detail because it's important and it was on this other building, or this is a very specific style, that's a significant thing. They can help kind of bring some of those details out once you've got the groundwork laid. The folks at the offices can really help with that. So for a local nomination, it's reviewed by a local landmarks board or commission, as we were mentioning earlier. And then for both the Washington State Register and the National Register, it's reviewed by the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, the Washington State Advisory Council. And that's a council that meets 3 times a year, and they review all of the register nominations and either approve them to be submitted to the National Park Service, the keeper of the National Register, or if they feel like it doesn't qualify for the National Register, often it will be added to the state register. So that's kind of this little dotted line I've got going on here. As I said, after the ACHP reviews, DAP submitted, it becomes added to the National Register of Historic Places. This text you cannot see very well, but for some local ordinances, in addition to the Landmarks Board or Commission, some ordinances require review by, the City Council or some other governmental body to actually make the designation official. See Logan nodding.
Yeah. City council approves.
Gotcha. City Council and Tacoma's the same way. And then once it's approved by that landmark. So what does it mean to be one of these things? So if you are a local landmark, you are potentially eligible for the special tax valuation, the property tax program Logan was mentioning. And also I have here future changes must be reviewed. So once you're in the landmarks program and you want to, like Logan said, make any changes or additions or anything to your house or property, the Landmarks Commission needs to review those and can offer really great advice too. I think one of the kind of most useful things is if people are interested in, increasing the capacity of their house or something and they have an idea, maybe the commission can help you reconfigure that idea that's a little bit more compatible with the historic character, but still gets you what you want. And so that's more the role as opposed to the stick, the no, you can't do that. That's the kind of exciting part and the fun part is helping people make those changes sympathetically. If you're on the National Register, there's another tax credit program you can be eligible for, which is the National Historic Tax Credit, and that one is for income-producing properties only. So that's generally commercial properties, and again, that'd be a bit of a conversation for a Preservation 102 workshop, but that's another financial incentive that's available, and also a special tax valuation. You'll see that there's not really anything under the Washington Register. Unfortunately, there are no particular programs that come along with the Washington Register. So for the most part in Washington, other than honor, which I mentioned earlier, most people go for either a local listing or a national listing. Those are kind of the two that we focus on the most in Washington. Then I made this other diagram if you were already diagrammed out. So we've got the 3 registers we've been talking about, the financial benefits of the national credit, the state credit, and whether it's honorary or regulatory. And you can see kind of national registers. You can do either financial incentive, but it's honorary, Washington Heritage Register, honorary, Spokane. You're eligible for the state program, and it's actually regulatory. There's review that has to happen with that property. So hopefully hopefully that gives a general overview about all the different registers and what they mean. Now we'll move on to talking about the Browne's edition, which, as Logan said, 207?
It's
Ish.
303 resources.
303 resources added to the local register, which now get to be reviewed anytime there's a change that has to be made or is looking to be made. And as I mentioned, the Washington Trust was really pleased to be able to write a letter in support of this particular change, which is so important, and hopefully will not be the last, but only the first of many historic districts. So I'm going to go ahead and let Logan introduce the district, and then we'll actually just move right into Dave Williams, who's going to talk a little bit about the Browne's Edition Neighborhood Council and kind of the work they did. We're going to talk about kind of how did this happen, you know, kind of what was the impetus, what does it mean, and what were actually the nuts and bolts of getting a district passed. So if you're interested in protecting a neighborhood in your community, this hopefully will be helpful. So I'm going to use it so it's forward and back.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Just 1 second to set my stuff. Yeah, here it is. All right, jeez. I'm gonna flip back real quick to this slide because I think it's pretty cool. These are the 5 reasons that a house can be nominated for the Spokane Register of Historic Places. Really, it's a lot of words, but really there's just 5 reasons. Either the building is important to the broad patterns of Spokane's history, that's 1, or A. It's important because a significant person lived there, or it was their primary property of theirs. Because it's architecturally significant, we don't really care who lives there. Either somebody who designed it or just the prominence of the architectural style. It's likely to yield archaeological remains, which we don't have any of those in Spokane. I mean, we have lots of sites that are likely to yield archaeological remains, but none that are listed under that category. And then the 5th category, which Jay talked a little bit about, is brand new. Sort of like, lets the commission make some more broad decisions about what is a significant property. We have actually listed 1 property under this category, and you may be familiar with it if you live in Spokane. It's the German American Society Hall on 3rd, I think it's 25 West 3rd. And that building suffers from one of the problems that Jay was talking about. It has almost 0 integrity. The building in almost no way resembles the original structure that was built there. However, there's obviously this intangible heritage that exists in the city's oldest ethnic club that's still in existence. And so it was a good opportunity to sort of put this, this new category into work. Now we have 1 property listed under category E. Also, it made me think of when Jay was talking about integrity, standard number 4 of the Secretary of the Interior's Standards for Rehabilitation specifically says that properties can attain historic features over time. And I think that that's really interesting because the German American Society has certainly attained significant features over time that it didn't originally have. So I just wanted to jump back to that, fly back to Browne's edition here. So Spokane has a lot of National Register historic districts, I think 28 of them if I'm not mistaken. They're all over the city, but we didn't really have any local register historic districts. We had a couple things that kind of resembled a local historic district, but in reality, they were a collection of individually listed properties. 1 on Corbin Park and 1 out in Hilliard. And each one of those, each property had signed an individual management agreement with the property owner. And so they're just not as strong because when we first went to go sign those management agreements, as you can imagine, some folks didn't want to sign them. And so you have holes in your historic district. There was no way in the Spokane Municipal Code to draw a boundary and say every property within this boundary gets a vote, and if we decide that this is something we want to move forward for, we can designate the whole district as a local historic district. We worked really hard, and Megan worked really hard with the neighborhood and council member Lori Kinnear to pen a new ordinance or a revision to our ordinance that allowed for that process that I just explained. Where we draw a boundary, we identify the resources within the boundary, and we have a vote of the property owners, each developable parcel getting one vote. And that's how you determine whether or not there is owner consent to move forward with the nomination. We got that ordinance passed at the beginning of last year, and that let work on the Browns Edition Historic District begin in earnest. Because you couldn't do the old style in Browns Edition, where you sign a management agreement with each person. Just a game of scale that would be impossible. And so it was critical to have this other tool to work with. That doesn't mean that the neighborhood just started in the last year working on this. The neighborhood actually first approached our office in 2015. I was still in grad school. And so, like Jay was saying, these things take a long time, and Dave will really drive that home in a little bit, just how long these things take and how much work goes into making that happen. So what is Browns Edition? Where are we? Maybe you know about it, maybe not. But as the city starts to grow in the 1870s and into the 1880s, downtown is no longer sufficient to provide all the residential housing for the city, and especially the wealthy folks wanted to live outside of downtown. They started developing little neighborhoods. This was also an entrepreneurial opportunity for folks who owned property, and J.J. Browne capitalized on that. He had about 140 acres here, and he decided to develop it in 2 phases into a residential neighborhood, Browns Edition. His buddy, A.M. Cannon, he owned this property just south of here, and he did the same thing, but Browns Edition was a little more successful. A lot of the city's wealthy decided to build their opulent homes here, especially the second edition of Browns Edition, this far west side. It included Campbell House, which is sort of the roots of the museum that we're at today, but Finch Mansion and a number of other significant homes. But that doesn't define the neighborhood. The neighborhood has a really interesting housing stock. It has a whole lot of different things that really show that the neighborhood had a lot of different phases. That early phase from, say, 1884, when the first house was built. How do I use this little guy? There we go. This is the first house, the Browne house. It was actually moved to this location, but it's just down this street here. And it's what we consider to be the beginning of the historic district's period of significance. It starts in 1881. And we noticed the first sort of change in trends for this neighborhood in 1910. In 1910, we saw that a lot of those big opulent homes that were built just either 10 or 15 years ago were quickly being turned into apartments. Browns Edition, even that early on in 1910, was sort of changing. Wealthy folks were favoring a little different area of town on the South Hill, and a lot of these big mansions were being turned into apartments. But apartments were also being built. This is a row house right on Riverside. What year do you think this was built? 1900. Pretty cool. Challenges your expectations. You don't often think you're going to find this sort of condo-style row house, especially in Spokane, 100 years ago. But there it is, just right down on Riverside there. And this trend really sort of dictates the next phase of development in Browns Edition, which we say happened from 1910 to 1950. And we call this living dense in Browns Edition. Browns Edition got a lot more heavily populated, not just from those houses being turned into apartments, but also from apartment buildings being constructed, like this one here, or also some, that's all I got. Some newer apartment buildings as well, which you can walk around as you leave or drive, and you will see many of those. We ended the period of significance in 1950, so 1881 to 1950, and you might think, well, how did you make that decision? That's more than 50 years ago, so we could have continued to go further. But we saw a really clear change in the building patterns in Browns Edition then. We noticed that in 1950 was the last year that a single-family home was built in Browns Edition until 1994. We also found out that it was the last year ever that a multifamily and single-family home were built in Browns Edition. Maybe that'll change in the future, but 1950 is the last time that those two types of housing were built in the same year in this neighborhood. And so we could kind of see this clear breaking off, and so we decided that the properties that were built between 1881 and 1950 were significant to this neighborhood. That makes up about 85% of the properties, so a pretty good amount of them. And of those 85%, we determined that 75% of them had enough integrity to be considered historic. Integrity is sort of two different playing fields. When you're talking integrity about an individually listed building, we need to be a little bit more rigid because we're really talking about that building and what history it conveys. When we're talking about a historic district, we can be a little bit more flexible about integrity because we're really talking about the feeling that that whole district conveys, the sense of place that you get from being in that whole district. And so we're able to be a little bit more flexible, and buildings, if I took you in front of some of them in Browne's Addition, you'd be like, well, that's not historic, or that wouldn't be individually listed. But when we look at it as a whole, as part of this neighborhood, they're quite clearly significant to the story of Browne's Addition. Browne's Addition also has a park, pretty cool. It's Coeur d'Alene Park, it's the city's first park. And it also has this reconstructed bandstand that's in the center of the park. Not only that park, but also electric railroad line that went right down Pacific Avenue. Sort of talk about the residential nature of Browne's Addition beyond just the buildings. There's also a small commercial business district, which you may have been by. There's a little roundabout there that sort of makes it easy to identify. But it's always been a little neighborhood commercial. Originally had the Elk Drug Store, and today it's the Elk Beer Store. But very much the same building and just a slightly different use there. A lot of these resources have been maintained. I want to read something actually. Today I was digging and working on this a little bit, and I found this article from 1983. And it was about people that were trying to do the work that Dave just finished doing right now. And I read some of the quotes in that, and it really shocked me. But basically, a commission was formed to try to address the historic nature of Browne's Addition and how it's changing. And like I said, two of the quotes really struck me, and so I'm going to try to read this tiny writing and read them for you. But this is from the report that they penned. It says, quote, "Unless coordinated public action is taken, the quality of neighborhood will deteriorate, and its value as a stable inner-city residential community and a historic district will be lost." And it goes on to say, "The first priority listed is preservation of historic architecture. The next three priorities include assistance to fix up existing houses, alleviation of parking problems, and more streetlights and landscaping." If I gave this to the neighborhood and told them this was their platform in 2018, it's like almost exactly the same. And so this effort has been ongoing. People have been working really hard, like Dave, to try to save some of the historic resources, but also to try to address some other things. Browne's Addition's original parking patterns were primarily off-site, or on-site, either in a carriage house or a garage. Even the large apartment buildings that are built in the 40s and 50s tend to have these very large carports behind them. But the later development that happened in the 60s and 70s didn't include much on-site parking. And you can see the neighbors already starting to push back on that. Interestingly, we had the planners many times, the city's planners tell us that parking is not a historic issue and we shouldn't be wading into it. But clearly, parking and its patterns in Browne's Addition are historic, and there is a reason to be talking about them. But still, these efforts weren't successful. And there was another effort in the 90s that tried to do the same thing, to create a historic district in Browne's Addition, and likewise, it was unsuccessful. We'd had the National Register designation since the 70s, but this local designation was elusive. And it's primarily because, like I said, there was no place in the ordinance to allow it to happen. But in 2015, the neighborhood started losing some more buildings, and it changed the tone, and it activated people like Dave to try to do something different. And so I'm going to turn it over to Dave and let him talk a little bit about how the neighborhood got organized, what prompted them to get started, and specifically about the resources that they lost and why we have a local historic district today.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Dave Williams, and I'm a resident of Browne's Addition, and I'm also a member of Browne's Addition Neighborhood Council. I'm probably not the best person to be doing this tonight, so I have to give credit to one of the real leaders in this community, and certainly the leader in the Browne's Addition neighborhood. His name is Rick Biggerstaff, and he has been leader and chair of our neighborhood council for a number of years, and he was also one of the moving forces behind what occurred here. So I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Rick. But I also want to let you know that several members of the team are also here tonight, and so Son, Amanda, Tiffany, Louie, are you still back there, Louie? We were all just on the team that helped make this happen. So if I miss any points, folks, send me a signal, let me know, okay? And you can help me out a little bit. I say I'm probably not the best person to be presenting this because this has been a project, as Logan just mentioned, that's been going on for 4 years. And it was just completed a couple of months ago. Actually, officially just completed last month by the city council and the mayor's signature on a new ordinance. But the effort has been going on for 4 years. Now, my wife and I have only been living in this neighborhood for 3 of those 4 years. And so upon coming here, we decided that we wanted to get involved in the neighborhood council. And in doing so, we made 2 important discoveries working with the people in the neighborhood council here in Browns. The first one is that there is a real sense of community and there's a real sense of shared values for the people that live in Browns Addition. The second thing we discovered is that those shared values result in action when it comes to this neighborhood council. They do the things that they need to do to protect this neighborhood and to make it a better place to live for all of us who are here. So when we ask about why we did this, the answer is that people in the neighborhood began to see things happening here. And as Logan said, there's a history of that going on for quite a while, but we began to see development taking place in this neighborhood that was simply not consistent with the character and the history of the neighborhood. Developers were able to come in here and get demolition permits and permits to build new buildings that were very contrary to the character of Browne's Addition because there was no city ordinance that prevented it. All they had to do was present a plan to replace a historic building with something new. And that something new did not have to meet any standards that respected the character of the neighborhood. So that was the impetus for getting this thing going. And our own experience moving to Browne's Addition was that we moved in 3 years ago in September. Within a couple of 3 weeks of us moving in, there was a property on 2nd and Chestnut, just a few blocks from here, and about 2 blocks from where we lived. And that property was demolished. It was a historic building, I think built in the 1890s. Do you need something here?
I was gonna point at this for you.
Okay, there we are, thank you.
This is the house.
I was out walking my dog one morning after driving past it to go to work, and it was there. And later in the evening, I'm walking my dog, and it's leveled. It was simply gone, and bulldozers had knocked it down. And in its place went apartment and condominium building with 15 units in it and only 6 off-street parking slots for that building. And I think Megan was one of the folks who might have mentioned at the time that for all the efforts that have been going on in Browne's Addition, this was probably the last straw. And indeed it was. I think, having that process begin and then seeing this occur was one of the things that really mobilized people in the community to get going with this. And what we wanted to do was preserve the character of the historic homes and the character of this neighborhood. And that's important because Browne's Addition, as Logan said, was the first real organized neighborhood outside the downtown area. And Coeur d'Alene Park, which is a real beating heart of this area, was the first city park established in Spokane. So that all exists here in Browne's Addition. And what makes Browne's Addition special to all of us is the architecture, the culture, and the atmosphere. That's what makes Browne's Edition what it is, and that's what we were trying to preserve, and that's what led us to the actions that we wanted to take to protect that. Like I said before, developers virtually had no restrictions on what they could build here and whether or not it matched the character of this neighborhood. So that's the why. The how is, and I'm gonna just say a couple things in general, and then Logan's gonna speak again, and then I'll come back and talk about the actual process that we went through during the balloting process, during the balloting time. But we began with partnership, we began with assistance from people who have technical expertise in preservation activities, and we began with cooperation. That included many initial discussions with the Browne's Edition Neighborhood Council and the Historic Preservation Office. It involved cooperation and assistance from other experts like the Spokane Preservation Advocates. It involved working with consultants in preservation, receiving legislative assistance at the city level from Lori Kinnear and Brian Beggs, who are our representatives on the city council. They began to draft, in cooperation with all these other folks, the ordinance that was just recently passed that allowed for our local district to be established. We canvassed door to door early in the process. About a year ago in October, we were canvassing door to door simply to let our neighbors know that there was going to be a ballot process the following year. That would be 2019, and to acquaint them with the idea that we are trying to do something to preserve the neighborhood. We worked with the city council to get this done. We worked with the planning commission. We worked with the Historic Landmarks Commission, and also while we worked with the residents of Browne's Edition. I'm going to come back in a few minutes and I'll tell you about the election process, but this was the basis for the things that we did initially to get this going.
You can stay there, because I'm gonna be quick.
Okay.
So once the neighborhood had gotten that initial pulse and it kind of shown that this was heavily supported, our office went out and got a grant from DAP, some federal pass-through money, and we were able to hire a consultant to help do that nomination piece that Jay was talking about earlier that's often so challenging. Consultants prepared a nomination, made the case for Browne's Edition, why it was historic, drew a boundary, and set that period of significance. We also went through and did a resource page for every single resource in the neighborhood. So we got some photos of it, we identify how the integrity of it, whether the siding is intact, the windows are intact, is the plan intact. We made a decision on whether or not it was still contributing to the neighborhood, provided a physical description, and also tried to put some history in it if we could. If we could find historic photographs, we included those as well. It's a pretty intensive level survey considering it's a historic district with 300 and something resources. The other challenging piece is to create the guiding document. I was mentioning the standards of the National Park Service standards of rehabilitation, which we could have used those for Browne's Edition. That's what we used for all individually listed properties in Spokane. But it's very challenging to make that apply to every property. And so we actually wrote a whole new document of Browne's Edition standards and guidelines, which also allowed us to customize the document. Generally, individually listed properties get reviewed for changes in paint color. Browne's Edition residents didn't want paint color reviewed, so we removed that, and they won't have to get any approval from our office to change their paint color. Same thing with landscaping. They didn't want any review over landscaping. Corbin Park did want some of that, so we were able to sort of provide some customization to Browne's Edition that otherwise would have been more challenging to do without this specific document. Corbin Park does actually have one of these. We sent out postcards like this one, trying to reach out to the neighborhood, trying to get their attention, trying to get them to come to workshops. And we held 3 or 4 workshops in the neighborhood to help take the feedback to make those documents as good as we could. And then eventually we sent out a ballot with self-addressed, postage-paid envelopes that the neighborhood paid for. They paid for this postage and also for the printing costs. And we sent these ballots out to all the neighbors. And I'm going to turn it back over to Dave so he can tell us how they made that happen.
I can't possibly do justice to describing the amount of technical work that Logan and Megan did that the Spokane Preservation Advocates helps us with the legislative work that went into making this happen. I'm not even going to try to describe that, and I'm not going to describe the document that Logan just mentioned that lays out all of the regulations around historic preservation and what buildings need to look like as a result of this ordinance. But what I am going to talk about is kind of the grassroots effort that people like Son and Amanda, Tiffany, Louis, and several other people really put into making this happen at the local level. The ordinance that was passed by the city council that required this advisory vote, and that's really what it was an advisory vote. It wasn't binding on the city council. But they wanted to know what the people of Browne's Addition thought about creating this local historic district. And so they established that we would have a 60-day period where a vote would be taken. And the Historic Preservation Office sent out the ballots, as Logan just described. And they required us to have a 50% plus one vote in order for them to consider that the property owners, who were the ones that were sent ballots and voted, really wanted there to be a sort of local historic district in this neighborhood. So, in order to help facilitate that, our very active Browne's Addition Neighborhood Council formed a committee. All the individuals that I've talked about are here tonight. We're on that committee, plus several others. And we began to design a campaign to make sure that we could get to our neighbors and support this ordinance. And I'll just tell you a few of the things that went into that campaign. We put out media notices. We let news outlets and print news let them know what was going on. We got, I think, fairly good coverage in the community about this whole process as it was occurring. We used social media. Browne's Addition Neighborhood and the Friends of Coeur d'Alene Park have Facebook accounts, and there's the Next Door account that talks to people in the area about what's going on. We put lots of notices in those social media outlets. We used yard signs. We came up with a logo called Pro Browns. And I think one of the reasons that we wanted to make it Pro Browns was to get away from the stereotype that this ordinance was all about just preventing development, stopping people from coming in. And we wanted to emphasize the fact that we still want development. We still want growth in Browne's Addition. We simply want that growth and development to reflect the historic nature of where we live. And so Pro Browns was what we elected, and that was seen in yard signs and in other advertisements to promote the vote and get people to support this idea. So we had a 60-day period, and the ballots were sent out, I think, around the 20th of June this year. And about 3 or 4 weeks later, we got the committee together, and we had gotten some very good data from Logan about how many people had voted and how many people had voted yes, because we had a very specific number. We needed to pass this, and I think the number was 176, something like that?
Yes.
176 yes votes. And so when we got that data from Logan, we looked at it and we carefully studied it, and then we decided to panic. Because initially, in the first half of the voting period, we didn't have much going in terms of those yes votes. We needed to do more to get people to vote. And I'll tell you about one of the hurdles that we had to get over in a little bit. But as a committee, we decided that we really needed to get active. We needed to get feet on the ground and do something to encourage people in the neighborhood to vote. So we decided to do door-to-door canvassing of every homeowner in the neighborhood. We divided the neighborhood up into 4 sections, and then a team or an individual was assigned to each of those 4 sections, and we just went door to door. We didn't have to knock on every door because Logan and I think the city clerk's office provided us with a really comprehensive list of people who had not voted. And so we could focus on that list, and we know at about the halfway point, those that still needed to return a ballot. And we could go address those people face to face, tell them about the vote, give them information, and encourage them to vote most of all. We decided we were not going to tell people we really are here to get a yes vote from you. What we decided to tell them was, we're really here to get you to vote. And I'll tell you why that's important in just a minute. But we were very successful, I think, in addressing the people that we could find in the neighborhood. And then we also employed the help of the Spokane Preservation Advocates to do something that was really needed here. There is a high percentage of property owners, parcel owners, who do not live in Browne's Addition. They are absentee owners, they live elsewhere, perhaps they have property that they rent out through a property management company. Some of them are owned by LLCs or family LLCs. And so we had to reach out to people who didn't live in Spokane. A number of them lived in Spokane, but a lot of them lived out of town. And so SPA decided that they could help us by reaching out to those LLCs or reaching out to those people that live out of town, either in a phone banking effort or through mail, to see if we could get them to vote. And so we had a great partnership and a great deal of help from them, plus we had our own feet on the ground in this neighborhood to make that happen. On a positive note, I think it was incredibly helpful to have the city and Logan's office be so good about providing us with data. That kept us up to date all the time on where we needed to go and who we needed to address and how close we were getting. Because that final threshold only got met, I think, the week that the election was over, at the near the end of August. And so we were collecting ballots right up till then. We also had permission from the office in the city to go and collect ballots to people that we were actually canvassing. Because we had the parcel numbers, we could go up to a home and say, we're interested in making sure that you vote, and we can do a ballot right here if you like. And again, we didn't want to put any particular political pressure on people which way to vote. We just wanted to tell them how important it was that they vote, and we were able to collect, we were given that permission to collect those ballots and turn them into the City Historic Preservation Office ourselves. And so that was an important part of this. We did make it over the threshold, but what I also wanted to mention tonight, because there may be some other neighborhoods that are interested in doing this, is that we had some hurdles to get over. I won't call them roadblocks because we made it through those roadblocks, but there were hurdles we had to get over, and there were 4 major ones. First of all, as I mentioned before, there are a number of absentee owners in this neighborhood. So that made contact with them particularly difficult. The second major hurdle that we had to get over was that the election took place at a really bad time of year. From late June until late August, it's vacation time. And a number of people were out of town. Mail gets collected in different ways when people are gone. And sometimes it was difficult for people to understand that this was something that they needed to do because it's just not a good time of year. We had initially hoped that the vote would take place in the springtime of this year, but because of some steps that we had to go through with the Planning Commission and the Landmarks Commission, it took additional time and we had to push the vote back. The third thing that I think was a hurdle for us to get over is that there was some confusion about the ballots amongst our residents. It didn't come from the county elections office like other elections do. It came from the Historic Preservation Office. It didn't look like an official ballot to some people. Even though it said official ballot, was stamped right on the envelope. You tried, you did everything you could do. You gave them a stamped envelope and told them right on the front what it was, but some people just didn't see it that way because it did not look like other ballots that they've received from government in the past. And so that was a hurdle that we had to explain to some of the people when we went out and said, we haven't received your ballot yet. And they said, oh yeah, I think I got that. I didn't realize what that was. So we were able to give them a new ballot and get a vote from them. And the fourth hurdle that we had to get over was that there was a ruling by the city attorney's office that any ballot that was not returned, in other words, somebody just decided they weren't gonna vote, or they didn't get it, and they didn't have a chance to vote, but anyone who was on that list as a property owner and did not return a ballot, that was counted by the city as a no vote. And that's a tremendous hurdle, because in elections, we all know there's always going to be a certain portion, particularly in this country for some reason, of people who simply don't vote, don't feel like it's important, don't understand the importance of it, and so they slough it off, they don't vote. And I think the decision by the city attorney's office to say that just a ballot that doesn't come back is a no vote was something that was a real hurdle for us. And we had to get over that, and we started, let's just call it, a 35 to 40% no vote right off the bat. And so that's why it was so important to get people to vote, and it was so important to have the number of yes votes that we needed to get this thing passed. I would hope that the city council here will maybe look at a revision to that if future neighborhoods or neighborhoods in the future are going to try to do this, because I don't know of any other election where an unreturned ballot or a ballot not passed is actually counted in some way, but that's what was done here. Anyway, I feel very proud to be part of this process. I thank my teammates that are here and the leadership that we had from Rick, and certainly the help that we got from Megan and Logan throughout this process. It made it something really special in Spokane, and we're all very proud that it happened this way.
We're trying to make it look official, valid, and closed. I'm just going to share the numbers with you real quick. We don't have too much more time. I want you at least be able to ask a couple questions. But like I said, each developable parcel within the district boundary received one vote. There were 274 property owners with 371 votes. Over 62% of property owners returned a ballot, so that's really good. Of the ballots that were returned, nearly 82%, or 201 of 246, voted yes in favor of forming the district. However, due to the rules set forth in 17D-100-100, all non-returned ballots were essentially counted as no votes. Therefore, the percentage of yes votes is 54%, or 201 of 371. 186 yes votes were required to form the district, and a sufficient number of yes votes were received to move forward with designation. Like Dave mentioned, City Council took up the action, Landmarks Commission took up the action again and moved it forward. City Council took up the action and passed it in a 6-1 vote. The mayor signed it on October the 3rd, and it goes into effect on October the 4th, and it goes into effect on November the 3rd. So, Browne's Edition will officially be a local historic district in less than 20 days, or whatever that is. So.
Well, what a great success story, and I just want to say thank you to Logan and Megan who helped plan but couldn't be here tonight, to both of the Daves for coming and speaking this evening, and for you all who attended. I am going to open it up for questions for myself or any folks from SPA or Logan and Dave with Browne's Edition, but I did just want to mention before we kind of open it up that we are having a reception outside from 7 to 8:30. You're welcome to stay and mingle after we're done here. Learn a little bit about the trust, the Washington Trust, SPA, and city as well. So we do have about 5 minutes, not as much as I was hoping, but hopefully the information that we went over was useful and interesting. And I hope also that the thing, if you don't remember anything else from tonight, the thing that you go home thinking about is partnerships. That, to our experience, to the Washington Trust, that is what makes everything happen, and hopefully the Browne's Edition case demonstrated that as well, and some of the other issues I talked about. So we'll go ahead and open it up to questions, and I'll go ahead and turn on the lights if anybody, yeah.
Hi, congratulations on the success of the Browne's project. I was curious how much the campaign cost and who paid.
I know that on our end, Dave can maybe tell a little bit more about the neighborhoods end, but we got a federal grant it's through DAP, but it's federal pass-through money. And I believe it was about $20,000, and every dollar of that went to some consultants, one of which is our commissioner, Betsy Bradley, and deserves much credit for this project. But they prepared all the documents for us, and then just all of our staff time that went into it, which unfortunately we didn't capture as well as we should have. And next time we're going to work really hard to capture how much of our staff time goes into the project. We probably spent a negligible amount of money on mailings and stuff like that, say $300 or $400. I'm not sure about the neighborhood, but I know they spent some as well.
I really can't give you a figure, but I can tell you what we paid for. We paid for yard signs. We paid for some of the postage that went out. We paid for materials that we passed out, I think during the canvassing that took place before the vote. And I think that's about it. Dave, go ahead, please.
SPA paid for the yard signs.
Okay. Very sorry.
Partnerships.
I don't hear that SBA paid for the yard signs that you saw a picture of as well. So,
Okay.
and we've this federal pass-through money is great. We've applied for that same grant to try to do another local historic district in the Cliff Cannon neighborhood. I have a little flyer for it. I'll throw some of them out there if you want to grab one. But we've got that federal pass-through money from them, and we're going to use that to try to create the documents for that case. So.
Thank
Sorry,
you.
I don't have a figure
No, that's
for you.
great.
Okay.
Other questions?
Yeah, I'm just curious how big your neighborhood group was. You know, did it start with like one person and then just kind of grew?
Well, actually, our Browns Addition Neighborhood Council is pretty famous for having a lot of participation. We have monthly meetings in which we do regular business, and on any given month, you're probably going to find 25 or 30 people there. The people that come visit us and go to other neighborhoods always comment that Browns Addition usually has a great turnout, so we do have a lot of participation. The committee that did the work this summer, most of the grassroots committee, I think, was a membership of about 10 or 11 people. Would you say, Louis, Tiffany? Yeah, about 10 or 11 people. And there were a couple of people that drifted in and out of there and were able to help at different times too. So, it's not, geographically, it's not a big neighborhood. It's just a very dense neighborhood. So, you can walk from one end to the other in 5-10 minutes in either direction, so.
Is the council a part of like the Spokane City Council, or is it just your?
No, it's part of
just
the
like a
neighborhood
unofficial?
organizations.
No, not unofficial. Spokane has a unique system in which they really empower 20-something neighborhood councils who have like some real decision-making power, actually have a little bit of money, and in Browne's Addition, get things done. And I think it's worth mentioning that this initiated in a Browne's Addition neighborhood council meeting. This idea came up, and there was a vote of the neighborhood council folks who have varying interests in historic preservation. Mostly are just residents, and it was a unanimous vote by the voting members that day to move forward with trying to pursue a designation. So it really started in the neighborhood council and finished with the neighborhood council in pretty much every way.
How would you find out if your neighborhood has a council? Just
Every neighborhood in Spokane has one. So Browne's Addition is pretty small. Like I said, right now we're working with the Cliff Cannon Neighborhood Council. I know I heard the chair from Peaceful Valley Neighborhood Council. That's probably even smaller than Browne's Addition, but just down the hill there. Like I said, there's 20-something. Mine is huge. I'm in Ledger, or they gave us a new name, Nevada Heights or something. I know, it sounds nicer than it is. But we're in Nevada Heights, so yeah, you can find them. And honestly, go get involved with your neighborhood council. Beyond preservation, what a great group of people to engage with and actually talk about the space where you live. Not the city you live, but the space where you walk and live and sleep every night. So
I think the city website, the My Spokane website, you can find the information about your neighborhood council on it.
there's a map on there you can plug in your
Yeah.
address.
Perfect, thank you.
So you can find out, and you can get the names of people that run it too.
It's got the dates they meet and.
We've got time for maybe one more.
Yeah.
I came to find out what I could about the cemetery grants and what type of issues would people be typically applying for on that grant.
Yeah, I'm happy to chat with you about that specific program that we manage, and essentially it's a capital